So I just want to welcome everyone who's joining us today. And I want to thank Victoria and Emily and Guillermo for joining us for this really important and interesting presentation that I think we're about to hear. My name is Rachel Matson. I'm one of the coordinators of the Digital Library Federation's Government Records Transparency and Accountability Interest Group, which is sponsoring and hosting this webinar right now. I'm just really excited about this presentation and looking forward to hearing from our presenters. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go through and do a really long introduction to them, but I'm going to post in the chat box a link to a document where you can read all about their bios and stuff. And I would encourage you to, if you haven't read their bios, just familiarize yourself with them. And if you haven't opened up your chat box, again, I would just like to suggest that you open up the chat box in the Zoom meeting space, which you can do by clicking on the word chat at the bottom of your screen, just so you can communicate or see any links that we want to share with you, so that you can do further investigations as you would like, or troubleshoot if you have any problems with audio or anything. The presentation is going to last about 45 minutes today, and then we're going to open it up for questions and discussion for about 15 or 20 minutes afterwards. And we really encourage you guys to, everyone to ask whatever questions you have or engage in whatever kind of creative strategizing for collaborations that that might occur to you as the presenters are speaking. And so with no further ado, I just want to pass it off to Emily Crichton, Victoria Lopez, and Guillermo Cantor, who are going to lead us in the next 45 minutes. Thanks, you guys.
Great. Thank you so much, Rachel. Appreciate the invitation to speak to you all today about some of the work we do around government transparency and immigrant justice. I think we're each going to introduce ourselves and give a little bit of background about the organizations that we work for, and a little overview of our work, and then dive into some examples of how we use government records, the Freedom of Information Act, some of the challenges we face, and some examples of the kind of work we do and why these government records are so integral to the advocacy that our respective organizations do in furtherance of immigrants' rights in this country. So, as Rachel mentioned, my name is Victoria Lopez. I am a staff attorney with the American Civil Liberties Union. The ACLU is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization. We are a membership organization, and we do litigation and policy advocacy work and public education work to advance the civil liberties and civil rights of people across the United States. And we work in many different areas: prisoners' rights, immigrants' rights, privacy and technology issues, LGBT rights, reproductive freedom issues. And my work specifically focuses on immigration detention and challenging both the expansion of immigration detention in this country, as well as investigating and challenging unconstitutional conditions of confinement in immigration detention facilities. So that will be the lens and sort of the lens in which I speak to you and make comments about the work that I do through the lens of immigration detention. And I wanted to give a little bit of background about the Department of Homeland Security and its immigration detention apparatus. And so within the Department of Homeland Security, there are two sub-agencies that I think our comments are going to focus on. One is Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, and the other is Customs and Border Protection, or CBP. Both of those subcomponent agencies within the Department of Homeland Security manage a detention system. There are extreme challenges in both of those systems with respect to enforcement activities and detention conditions. Within the ICE system, there are over 200 facilities that the federal government uses for the detention of immigrants. And it is through a combination of contracts with county jails and private prison companies like CCA and GEO Group and Management Training Center that Immigration and Customs Enforcement detains close to 40,000 people on any given day across the country for the purpose of ensuring that folks appear at their immigration proceedings. And this is a civil detention system. And many of the folks all of the folks that are in these detention centers are going through some type of immigration process, whether that is seeking asylum or contesting their deportation from this country after having lived here for many, many years. Many have lawful immigration status. Some folks are undocumented and trying to obtain lawful immigration status. So the detention system is, there are many people with varying legal issues facing a very complex legal system in a detained setting, which is, as you can imagine, incredibly harrowing for all of the people that are in this situation. I will also say, right, that when I speak of challenges in the detention system and in the work that we're speaking about here, related to government transparency, ICE and CBP are just notorious for being not transparent about their operations, about their detention systems, about their enforcement activities. There are advocates in organizations that have been, filing FOIA requests and trying to obtain information about these agencies.
I'm sorry, can I just interrupt you, Victoria, really quickly? We're not seeing any slides. Are there supposed to be slides?
Oh, no, I'm sorry. I am not presenting any slides today. Emily and Guillermo are presenting slides, so when I'm done speaking, they'll put up their slides.
Great. Okay, just wanted to check about that.
Apologies. Sorry, I should have said that at the beginning.
No, thanks.
Okay. So I was just saying, these two agencies in particular are it's just difficult to get any information. So whether you are an immigrant going through your immigration case in an immigration court setting, or a person who is in detention and trying to obtain their medical records from ICE, it is just really difficult to obtain any records, even if it's related to your own case, your own situation. And a lot of the work that we do at the ACLU is focused on some of these systemic issues with detention conditions in the detention system. And so much of our work around FOIA in particular is trying to obtain records about the detention operation system, whether that has to do with solitary confinement or hunger strike policies and practices, deaths in detention. And we use the information that we gather from those FOIA requests to do a variety of advocacy that includes, disseminating information through media, through reports, various publications that we do at the ACLU, often in partnership with other organizations. We use that information to inform policymakers about various bills or policy changes that we are advocating for, whether that's at the federal level or otherwise. Of course, to educate our members on the issues that we're working on. So there are two pieces that I wanted to highlight, or two examples in the work that we do, but I did just by way of background, one other piece that I did want to mention, right, is that in this administration, we are definitely seeing, the intention of expanding the immigration detention system, weakening detention standards that apply to the way that these facilities operate. And so there is definitely a feeling, for me anyway, and perhaps, Emily and Guillermo can share as well, a heightened sense of need to have as much transparency as possible in this moment, because this administration and the agency at this time period have been changing things so quickly and to such detriment and devastation to the immigrant community that laws like FOIA and even state public record acts in some cases have been vitally important to being able to expose what is going on in the detention system. So a couple of examples, and maybe this is something that you all have plugged into, is, in August of last year, the National Archives and Records Administration issued a notice that ICE submitted a proposal, a schedule for document destruction of various records related to their detention operations, including documents related to the use of solitary confinement, to deaths in detention, to sexual assault in detention, as well as monitoring reports and logs about the people who are detained in ICE facilities. This was, frankly, a huge shock to me, I will say, and to many folks in the immigrants' rights community, that ICE was putting forward this proposal. Especially given the sensitive nature of these types of records and about their long-standing, and in the context of their long-standing just lack of transparency about detention operations. This particular example of our advocacy was just incredible. I mean, we were able to, there was a sign-on letter to the National Archives from various immigrants' rights organizations. I can't even remember how many signed on ultimately, but opposing the ICE proposal to destroy these records. And I will say that there was also just an incredible public outcry, and many of you maybe participated in this, and I thank you if you did, because just on the ACLU platform alone, there were over 30,000 people who signed on to a petition to the National Archives opposing the ICE proposal to destroy these records. So it was just the outpouring of opposition here was really just an incredible moment. There was great media interest in this issue, great public interest in this issue, and really I think opened many eyes to the injustices that are going on in the immigration detention system and how critically important it is to preserve many of these records, not just to preserve the constitutional rights of people who are facing this system, but also for historical purposes and for government transparency and accountability purposes. So that most recently has been just really an interesting and important synergy where these issues have come together. The second sort of example that I wanted to point to is the ACLU's work around deaths in detention. So because of just the sprawling nature of this system and just the very well documented inadequate medical and mental health care that folks are exposed to when they're in immigration detention, there are sadly people who are dying in immigration detention. It is needless, it is tragic, and frankly, it's a crisis that, it's a crisis. Our work around deaths in detention started in about 2009, and we the ACLU submitted a FOIA request to ICE for information about deaths in custody, which they had at that point were not reporting out publicly in any way. Subsequent to us obtaining records through FOIA, there was great media interest in the issue and reporting out using the documents that we obtained through FOIA, as well as their own FOIA requests and documents that they obtained. So there was amazing reporting at that time from the New York Times, from the Washington Post, and many other media outlets about the crisis of deaths of people dying in immigration detention. And not just that folks were dying, but that the government was not tracking the number of people who were dying, that the government was not able to point to the causes of death for people who were dying in their custody. And so really exposing just the complete lawlessness that was going on, and frankly, to some extent, still going on. Through that advocacy, our FOIA work, the media reporting, a great deal of public pressure, and then policy advocacy by many immigrants' rights organizations, the agency was ultimately forced to change and to actually adopt some policies that require them to now publicly report deaths, in custody deaths, and to also go through a process of reviewing each of those deaths and bringing in experts to do reviews of how folks have died in detention. We also used that information that we obtained through FOIA to publish a report in 2016, and there have been other reports by advocacy organizations, including the Detention Watch Network and National Immigrant Justice Center and AIC and Human Rights Watch around this issue of deaths in custody. And those reports and many other reports in the immigrants' rights community have come from documents obtained through FOIA. The last thing I'm going to say, because I'm going to pass it on and then hopefully we can circle back with some questions about any of my comments, is that if you haven't yet seen, there was a piece published in The Intercept yesterday about sexual assault and sexual abuse in immigration detention. And I would point you to that report because it is horrific, and it points to specific cases of folks being sexually abused in immigration detention. But it also discusses the reporter also discusses the process by which she obtained the documents of reports of sexual abuse and the agency's responses. And it is really an eye-opening piece about the FOIA process and what it took for her to get the information to report out on this very important issue. And that was published yesterday in The Intercept by Alice Sperry. I'm gonna stop there. My time is up. And then happy to answer questions later.
Okay, great. Thanks, Victoria. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you to all who are joining. My name is Emily Creighton. I'm the Deputy Legal Director here at the American Immigration Council. And we are going to pull up just a few slides to talk and that sort of cover a little bit about what we do here at the council and how we focus our work around transparency. And generally for us, that means work around requests under the Freedom of Information Act and litigation that follows those requests when the government doesn't respond to us, as Victoria pointed out, which is often the case with these enforcement components. So the Department of Homeland Security and Immigration and Customs Enforcement, Customs and Border Protection, those agencies are often not responsive and difficult to work with. Sorry, we're trying to get through here with our presentation. So I wanted to just briefly talk a little bit about what the council, who we are. So the council is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization. We have multiple approaches to our work, and we have sitting with us also Guillermo Cantor, who heads up our research department. I'm on the legal team. We have found amazing synergies around our work in the transparency space in the last few years, where we litigate FOIAs to get information that are published in hard-hitting reports, and we'll talk about some of those in just a minute. And we are finding new avenues for advocacy also with our FOIA work. So a few examples about how we use FOIA. It really has become sort of this multi-pronged approach where we find ways to think through issues where we have some information but not enough. And one thing I just wanted to point out before we sort of dive in a little bit more to the substance of our work is that the American Immigration Council works very closely with the American Immigration Lawyers Association, which is a bar association for immigration lawyers that numbers about 14,000 immigration lawyers. And FOIA is an incredibly important tool, not just for some of the broad-based FOIA work that we're describing here, where we're trying to find out, smoking gun reports from government agencies and looking at, whether or not there is data that will tell a particularly important story about what's happening in the immigration field. But we also are mindful of the fact that every single day when an immigrant walks into immigration court, the entirety of the case that is held, the entirety of their case and all the information that's held by the government is often only available to them through the Freedom of Information Act. So incredibly, an immigrant has to ask the government for documents that it holds, about that particular individual. so that they can defend themselves against removal. And that is very, very important to immigration lawyers. It's important in our removal system. And the council has a practice advisory that sort of helps immigration lawyers figure out how to use FOIA and how to litigate under the Freedom of Information Act. And just as one example, I mean, in an everyday sort of situation where an immigrant is thinking about how to proceed with their case, a lawyer might say to themselves or ask their client if they have had any contact whatsoever with immigration enforcement. And if that person says yes, and if that lawyer guesses that they may have had some contact at the border, and they may have been apprehended and then expeditiously removed at the border, and they might have a removal order and they're not aware of that, all of that needs to be FOIA'd, because if they may be eligible for a green card through some other avenue, if they have some kind of pending removal order, that might impact their case. And so what might appear to be, a fairly straightforward green card application may in fact end up being a situation where a person attends an interview to adjust their status or become a green card holder, and they are referred to ICE through sort of a normal benefits interview process. And as this administration becomes more and more focused on enforcement and pushing the envelope in terms of applying the law as strictly and inhumanely as possible, those sort of situations are becoming more and more relevant. And so immigration lawyers heavily rely on FOIA in their everyday practice. It informs our impact litigation. So we have larger lawsuits along the lines of what Victoria is describing, where we challenge violations of the law. Unconstitutional conditions of confinement was one example of a case where we filed a FOIA to find out more about what's happening in border facilities, where they were holding people for long periods of time without adequate food, hygienic products, and beds. We are currently looking at a FOIA where we're asking about what sort of procedures they're using to turn away people at the border who are legitimately seeking asylum, and some of the processes there. And so we might file a FOIA when we're thinking about bringing a larger lawsuit that really, that alleges that the government is breaking the law, but we want to make sure that we have the facts, and we want to make sure that we understand what the policies actually are. And sometimes it doesn't work out perfectly, because FOIA litigation can be a long slog, and it takes a while potentially to find out what we want to know. But even if the FOIA litigation is happening simultaneously with a larger lawsuit that's bringing other claims, it often is helpful in sort of digging deeper and finding out more about the policies and the information there. And Guillermo will talk a little bit about this later, we look at FOIA to inform reports that we put out. This has been really important in recent years, where we now have a research team that is able to think about large amounts of data and analyze that data. So a couple of the reports I just wanted to mention that you can find on our website, AmericanImmigrationCouncil.org. One is called No Action Taken, and that report looked at CBP abuses at the border, and more specifically where CBP agents were acting with impunity. So complaints filed alleging abuse and mistreatment of immigrants that were never acted upon, and were not addressed even when formal complaints were filed. And this was unknown, and this was discovered through a FOIA request, and really got a lot of media attention. And there was a follow-up report, and if you have questions, you can ask Guillermo a little bit about that. And I talked before about synergies between the legal team and the research team, and I think this would be a wonderful future for, I think, the advocacy, research, and legal communities, if we could find ways to work together. And I'm curious to hear some of your thoughts at the end of this talk along these lines, because I think your community is another one where there could be collaboration along the lines of figuring out how to make our government more transparent. But this report looked at the criminal alien program, which is a program that's it's an internal enforcement program as opposed to enforcement actions that are taking place on the border. And so this interior enforcement program is really in jails and prisons throughout the United States, where ICE looks at immigrants who are incarcerated and decides that they want to remove them. And so while it seems relatively straightforward, it actually isn't. And what we found through a large data request that we filed this FOIA request to ICE in 2010, and we didn't really receive documents that were responsive to it until 3 years later, and then filed a report 2 years after that. So it took quite a long time, but the data that we got was really amazing, and that it demonstrated that even though this program was billed as a program that targeted criminal immigrants, it really was facilitating the removal of people who did not have criminal convictions, people who weren't convicted of violent crimes or crimes that the FBI classified as serious crimes. And so, there were other really interesting data points, like the program really seemed biased against Mexican and Central American nationals, and that the removals really differed from state to state. I thought it would just be interesting also to mention that the percentages of those who were actually removed with very serious crimes was 1.7% convicted of burglary, 1.6% convicted of robbery, 0.5% convicted of homicide. So really the serious criminals were not being removed from this program, and yet it was responsible for 3/4 of the removal of immigrants during the time period in which we received data. And then I want to mention that we place pressure on the agency through our FOIAs. And this is an area where we're experimenting a little bit more because we have such a non-responsive and difficult administration at the moment. And so we are thinking through whether or not filing a FOIA and drawing some attention just to the filing of the FOIA and immediately placing pressure on the privacy offices will help maybe even potentially influence whether or not a final policy is issued. And one place where we're trying that is in the family separation space. So it's sad to define it that way, that there is even a policy that we're observing where immigration officials at our borders are removing children from their parents or from adult family members and actually detaining them in separate places, and in many cases not facilitating communication as they should, or even tracking in a way that is visible to their family members and to advocates where these people are ending up. So we're hoping that maybe they don't issue this policy now that we've issued a FOIA and there are other advocacy efforts going on. And we're also looking very closely, Victoria mentioned, we're focused here on enforcement, but a real area of concern right now is also what's happening in immigration court, and real due process concerns around new policies that are being implemented by Attorney General Sessions, and challenges that immigrants are certainly going to be facing in immigration court. And so we're thinking about what is happening now that immigration judges are negotiating new contracts, new employment contracts with their union that that these contracts have they are beginning to measure performance of immigration judges by how many cases they actually complete. So we're looking at potentially fast tracking immigration cases that involve life or death matters, and a real potential due process crisis in the future. So those are some of the issues that we're looking at. I mean, I have more slides here, and I think I've gone a little long. So I'm just going to sort of mention that, we're looking, and Guillermo can talk a little bit more about enforcement under Trump and what that looks like. And so we filed a FOIA request that looks at apprehensions and arrests by CBP and ICE under the Trump administration, asked for really granular data about the individuals who were arrested. We may not know it yet, but whether or not they were removed, and a little bit more just about country of origin, whether they were DACA recipients and that sort of thing. I think I'll just highlight before I turn it over to Guillermo, that we are thinking about and really trying to coordinate FOIA work more with our immigrant rights organization partners, but also outside of the immigration space. We need to think more clearly about how to target particular issues and file FOIAs in areas where we can work together to think through how to get at the data, to think through how to analyze the data, and not to duplicate work. There's certainly enough to go around, but to really hone in on some issues and make a difference, I think that we're going to have to work a little more closely together than we ever have. And so we've started collaborating, and I've shared a little bit with Rachel that the immigrant rights community, we're now having monthly FOIA calls where we talk about the work that we're doing and update each other about the work that we're doing. And we're collaborating with groups outside of the immigration space too. And so progressive litigators who are looking at, FOIA not in the immigration space, how can we offer each other, tactics and strategies to be really successful in our transparency work. So with that, I'll turn it over to Guillermo to take us into some far more interactive slides, which should be exciting.
Okay, thank you, Emily, and hi, everyone. So as Emily mentioned earlier, my name is Guillermo Cantora. I'm the Director of Research here at the Council. And so my presentation is basically going to focus on how we use the information once we receive it from the agencies. And I think when Emily started her presentation, she was talking about how our organizations is organizing all these different functions, and we work very closely together. And for the past few years, we've been very successful in working very closely with the legal team, not just to get whatever they obtain through FOIA and then see what we can find there, but to be real thought partners in thinking about what information we want to get from the government in the first place. I wanted to say that one of the lessons we learned over the course of the years is that the more precise you are in drafting the FOIA requests and asking for things that actually exist, which like sometimes you don't know what they have or how they store the information and how they code it and all that, but this is incremental. So I feel that the more we do this kind of work and like getting these productions and taking the time to review them and analyze them give us a comparative advantage in terms of being better prepared to continue filing FOIA requests that have greater chances of being successful. So how we define our research here in the American Immigration Council, I'm not sure what everyone's background is on this call, but when people think about researchers, they think about a lot of different things. And when you are a researcher outside of academia, I think that the shapes and forms of the research work can be very diverse. So here at the American Immigration Council, we are convinced that good knowledge and information should be used to advance our larger goals and our immigration policy agenda. And so we are very intentional about that. And I wanted to make that clear because unlike some think tanks that want to be very much removed and isolated from the policy world, and they don't want to be contaminated by policy, so to speak, we really want to make sure that this information is used to advance better policies and better decision making. And so a lot of our work, our FOIA related work, we don't just use data and information we get through FOIA, but given that a lot of our work is very much focused on immigration enforcement and due process issues, we really rely a lot on information that can be obtained from the government, and that is what supports our analysis. So now, once we get the information, it's not that we just, for the most part, we try not to provide this raw data or raw information and put it on the website, but we really take the time to analyze, review the information, provide context, and put it in some more formal shape. And I'm going to talk a little bit later about the different products that we issue here in terms of publications. But the idea here is basically to support our advocacy and litigation efforts. We really work together with both the legal and the policy team to make sure that we try to maximize the impact of our work by trying to address one issue from all the different angles, from the research, policy, and litigation perspectives. And then we also have a strong communications department that help us package this information in a way that is like better, that is more accessible to like the policymakers that we are trying to inform. as I was saying earlier, we issue a variety of publications. We put together like these very short fact sheets that are, we have two big like types of fact sheets. Ones that are basic explainers of policy that we like in this legal and policy world, we assume that everyone understands when we're talking about expedited removal, for example, but the majority of policymakers, like Hill staffers, they don't have a clue about what this is. So we really take the time to really educate policymakers by providing these sort of educational materials. But then we do fact sheets that are basically providing basic like information, statistics, and finding from research done by others, as well as like summarizing government data. Could be like administrative records or could be census data, depending on what it is. We cover a range of issues, even though like our publication today is mostly focused on enforcement. We also do a lot of other work related to the immigrant population and immigration policy more generally. We do special reports. These are our more sophisticated, so to say, the kinds of analysis where we're really try to use primary data to draw attention to some particularly relevant policy issue. And we issue a lot of these over the past few years. We've been, I think that we've been really upping our game in terms of the quality of these reports, and also it all depends on the data that you're able to obtain. We are a small team here in-house, but we work very closely with academic researchers, so that is what gives us more capacity, but also it is very important for policymakers to have assurance that the research is done by people who have the credentials to be doing this, that have a lot of experience. Also, I was saying earlier, we're a very small team, so in order to expand our expertise and the areas that we can tackle, we really rely very heavily on these partnerships. Sometimes we commission research, sometimes we partner with academic researchers to work together on some specific project, and sometimes we translate an academic journal article into a more accessible report. So we do all those kind of things. We also do these kind of publications, we call them perspectives, that are basically like a longer op-ed. It's like the similar style where someone really provides some context and their qualified opinion on a particular issue. And these are not based on original research. It's like based on the knowledge or experience that someone has by being part of a particular, it could be a practitioner, or it could be an academic researcher, it could be an expert in the field, or someone who is who has a very particular point of view given the place they occupy in the immigration policy world. And then we have a daily blog. It's called Immigration Impact, where we really try to lift up relevant research, convey new ideas, put issues in perspective. We also cover the most recent immigration news there, but to the extent it's possible, we always try to put these issues in context. So it's not just the raw information, but we really try to explain why those issues are relevant. So basically, I just wanted to give you an overview of the environment in which we operate. So as I was saying earlier, we work very closely with the legal and the policy teams, and that happens in both directions, right? So we get information from our policy team, who are part of these relevant meetings with the administration, or like on the Hill, or they are part of like these broader networks with partners in the immigrant rights world. And so they feed us with information about what we need to know, what's relevant, what are the relevant issues at the time that we are better positioned to be addressing, given our unique position as well as our expertise. I mentioned earlier, we work very closely with the legal team, not only like in the specific case of FOIA, because through the help of the legal team, we're able to usually litigate and obtain the records that we're looking for, but also we try to be, as I said earlier, partners in thinking about what is it specifically that we need in terms of data, information, government documents, etc. And then we really try to push this information, the reports we produce and all these different publications to all these different actors in the policy world. We really have strong connections to media who usually give good coverage to our work. We do briefings in Congress on issues that we're working on. We also work closely with government agencies. Sometimes we have meetings to learn more about, like, we have some findings that come from the data that we obtain, and then we really need some explanation, some background about how we can better interpret the data to make sure that we're not providing any misleading information to the public. And again, we also consult with a number of advocacy groups who are part of our network. And also there are a lot of other research groups here in DC that meet regularly, and we try to be part of those meetings so we can share information about what each other is working on. And I mentioned earlier our special relationship with academic researchers, so I'm not going to elaborate on that. So I'm going to talk about this very briefly because Emily mentioned this earlier, but this is one perfect example of really very impactful work based on FOIA work. So in 2014, we issued this report, and I want to say sometimes it's very good, I said earlier, when you know how the government is keeping records and you know what we're looking for, and then the government is supposedly more likely to respond in a reasonable manner. But in this particular case, we filed a FOIA request, like the legal team, they were looking at a broader issue about people being, like signing documents that that led to their deportation. And so they had filed this FOIA request, which was followed by litigation. They were able to obtain a number of documents, and one of which it was a spreadsheet that one of my colleagues in the legal team brought to me, and she said, I don't know, we got this, we don't know what to do with this. Do you think this is, there is anything valuable here? And when I started looking at that, it really was extremely valuable because it showed how CBP was, Customs and Border Protection, was handling the complaints of abuse they received from people that had been in their custody. And so the findings were appalling because for the most part, these complaints had not received proper attention, or they didn't lead to any disciplinary action. And the allegation, of course, we don't know much about the investigation that had been conducted, but most of these cases that had been closed already were based on extremely serious allegations. And so that received wide media attention. And I think that one of the most interesting outcomes of this is that a few weeks after we issued this report, the head of the office that was in charge of reviewing and investigating these complaints was removed from that position, and that the agency after that decided to reopen all these cases and conduct new investigations to see what was going on. So another example that I wanted to share with you has to do with our research on these facilities where individuals are detained when they are in CBP's custody. This is on the border. There are these short-term detention facilities that are basically processing centers. People are taken there once they're apprehended on the border, and usually, like, these places don't have beds and are not meant to use for overnight stays. And however, what we found, we were able to obtain data about individuals that have been held in these facilities and the length of stay and the nationality and some basic demographic information. But what we found is that on average, people were held there for several days. And if you think about, and our legal team had done all this research about the conditions of detention, how people were treated when they were there in extremely cold rooms without adequate food, et cetera, and the fact that people were held there for several days was really appalling. We were able to use this information together with some other information we were able to to collect on the ground. So we have been for several years partnering with an organization in Mexico that interviews people upon repatriation. And so we have like tons of evidence that this was a recurring problem. And then we have been working at a detention center in Texas, interviewing women who had been held in this detention before being transferred into these family detention facilities. And again, the findings were very consistent there. We reviewed dozens of declarations in which the way in which people were describing the conditions of these cells were like really disturbing. So this again got a lot of attention because through our litigation we were able to obtain these images like I was showing the previous slide. Okay, I'll show more images later, but again, when these photos were discovered, were released, there were tons of media stories that were featuring the conditions of these detention centers. But our comparative advantage was that in addition to having this evidence, the visual evidence, we also had the data. And I think that for reporters, that made it very compelling because they had enough, evidence to be put into a news story. And so again, this got tons of media attention, and I think I'm running out of time. These are some of the images that the legal team was able to obtain through litigation. So here we have the perfect scenario in which we were able to issue a report at the same time that there was some significant moment in the lawsuit. So when we did media work around the lawsuit, we had the information, and we also followed with doing a congressional briefing on this issue. So here is like a member of Congress who is speaking at the briefing that we put together, as well as one of the lawyers who was part of the litigation, as well as one of the detainees, a former detainee who was sharing her story. So I think that is also what brought these dry findings into life, that this is findings that are affecting real people. When you can really tell the full story, I think it's much more impactful. So I'll leave it there. I think I went over, but we're happy to take questions. Thank you. Or perhaps there are already some questions that people were sending.
Yeah, there's already some questions. Thank you guys. That was extremely great. And we do already have a few questions in the chat, but I wonder there might be other people with questions. So Joseph, did you want to ask your question out loud?
Hey, yeah, sure. This is a question for Victoria. I was just curious if in your work you had covered or had learned about different regulations that are imposed upon the private contracting firms that are working for ICE and CBP with regards to records retention and submission, and if there's any information on rates of compliance for that, because I'd be curious to know if there's sort of a gap in the chain as to whether or not these private companies are following federal regulations regarding record retention, and whether or not that then is being transmitted through to the governing agencies.
Yeah, that's a great question, especially in the immigration detention space, where it's something like 65 to 70% of people that are in ICE custody are being held in privately owned prisons. So the process for these private contractors, right, is through their contracting with the federal government, and the contracting process and in the contracts between the federal government and the private prison company dictates sort of the standards that are supposed to apply for the detention of immigrants in that particular facility. And that's a really inadequate way of making sure that the facilities are complying with at least minimal constitutional requirements for detaining people. I mean, we've found really horrific conditions in privately owned prisons and very little accountability up the chain to the federal government in actually holding these private contractors accountable. And so whatever law is required of these private contractors should be part of the contract and the contracting process. But that's really difficult to get at through FOIA, for example, right? Like CCA and Geo Group don't have an obligation to respond under FOIA. And oftentimes the agency itself may redact or not provide information that is about their contracting practices or information that they claim is part, of that is actually, in the sort of ownership or in the auspices of the private company. So that's difficult to get at. On the records retention schedule, it's interesting, right? Because one of the issues that I'm looking at right now is the government's compliance with the Prison Rape Elimination Act. And so ICE facilities are supposed to be complying with the Prison Rape Elimination Act and regulations, and they're undergoing an auditing process of all of the immigration detention facilities for compliance with PREA. And in some of the audits, it's really interesting because something that I've noticed, and we'll have to poke around and get a little more information about, is in some of the audits of the CCA facilities, for example, the auditors note that the CCA policy for the retention of records around sexual abuse is, I want to say 5 years. Whether that, we're going to have to sort of back check that and see whether that complies with the law, because it seems like that is probably a really insufficient time for the private prison company to retain records. I hope that answers your question, or gets at some of the issues that you're raising there.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much.
That just raises so many other questions for me, which I think I'll be thinking about for a long time. And I would love to follow up with you guys about some of that at a later point. But in the meanwhile, I wondered if other people had questions. I definitely have some that I can ask, but I would love it if folks in the room who have questions would either speak up. Yes, is someone?
That was just me again, Rachel. I just want to say, I don't think I addressed the question of rate of compliance. And I think one of the challenges in terms of rates of compliance by any of the detention facilities in the ICE system is that there is no sort of public reporting of this information. So even if there is, and I think that this is questionable at best, whether there's any reporting from, county jails or private prisons to ICE about their operations, there is certainly no vehicle for public reporting by ICE, by the federal government, to the public or to members of Congress or to anybody about what that reporting looks like or what those findings include. And that's, that is in part why we do the work that we do around FOIA and litigating FOIA requests, is to try to obtain that information.
Are you saying there's no requirement that ICE has to report to any congressional committee about?
They do. So I didn't mean to imply that they don't report to Congress. They do report to Congress on various issues, but it is fairly limited. And so the question of how each of their operators of detention facilities, run their detention centers, I don't think that there is a very clear mechanism for that reporting to happen to Congress even. There, in this last appropriations bill, there were some reporting requirements about detention operations that were included, and so we'll see how that plays out. There were reporting requirements having to do, for example, with deaths in detention, with compliance with the Prison Rape Elimination Act, and there are certain timelines attached to each of those reporting requirements, and that would be to specific committees in Congress.
Thanks for that clarification. It's still harrowing and upsetting. Did anyone else on this call, please feel free to either raise your hand or just unmute yourself and ask a question or post it in the chat. Is there anyone here with a question? I have a bunch of questions that I can ask if other people don't want to say anything. I guess for me, the biggest question is always when I'm listening to you guys talk is how can we, as information professionals, librarians, archivists, working with our communities and in our institutions, amplify or support the both the idea that the federal government should be more transparent and that the agencies that are responsible for detaining and removing immigrants need to be held accountable, and there needs to be more transparency around how they work, but also getting this information into the hands of students and teachers and researchers, you know, so that they can use them and in their work, and that there can be, you know, sort of research access to these materials. And, you know, one thing I think about is I noticed that your reports are, I think your reports are at least at the American Immigration Council, are all available for download via PDF. And that you have, I know with Emily, I was speaking a little bit about the FOIA kind of clearinghouse situation you have on your website, where, and I can post that link in the chat if people are interested, where you post a lot of the documents you've FOIA'd on your website. And I just think as you know, as an archivist and a librarian, I think a lot about improving discoverability of this information. You know, for me, the fact that you have to FOIA a lot of this information, that it's not automatically made available to, you know, libraries and archives or to the general public, is upsetting in and of itself. But once the material is FOIA'd, I have a real interest in trying to make sure that that material gets disseminated, if it's not going to violate someone's privacy, to researchers and to students and educators, so that we can continue working with that material in other ways and really amplify the kind of problems that seem to really exist in the immigration detention area, among others. And I don't know if you guys have thoughts about whether you've collaborated or whether you make this material available to libraries, whether you think about, it's obvious, Guillermo, that you're thinking a lot about how to amplify what the legal team at the American Immigration Council is doing. But I don't know, it's just sort of a general inquiry about, you know, where do libraries come in, and how can we think about potentially amplifying the work that you're doing, or getting this material to researchers?
So this is Emily. I can just quickly say, Rachel and I, we had a good discussion about some future time when all of the data and sort of indecipherable document productions from the agencies would be in some format in which the public could easily access the data and draw conclusions, and we could all create narratives about what our agencies are actually doing, because this is our government and we should better understand how it functions. And we talked about, and Guillermo and I talk about, and with our colleagues and friends outside of our organization, we talk about what a database could look like where immigration-focused data and information is made available to media, to other advocates, to litigators. You know, how can we create a hub or a place to even sort of strategize and have conversations about how to improve our FOIA and transparency work? And I think where we focused on the ways in which we think, or we imagined, Rachel, that your community could support this work and participate in it, is to help translate it, to help figure out how to take the productions that we receive, and that, you know, and even maybe inform the process more as you become familiar with the way that we go about doing this. I think that probably some input at the outset of the process would be helpful, as we're finding, you know, researchers are, you know, participating in the FOIA request drafting process, have actually, you know, monumentally improved the results ultimately when we do receive the information. So I think that just maybe becoming part of the process and thinking about how to share the information. And yes, we have a clearinghouse is a very generous term for what we have on our website, which is, you know, web pages with some of our litigation documents, and then some indexes to some information that we found helpful, I would say I would easily, admit that we, in some cases, do not even fully understand everything that we look at, that we receive in document productions, for sure. So I think that someone who, librarians and others who are accustomed to looking at information that comes from agencies that, lawyers might not be, and helping think about how to make that more accessible would be an extreme help. I don't know if others have thoughts.
Yes, I do. You want to go
Yeah,
first?
no. I just was going to say, right, I think in terms of like being able to also take a look and access some of the information that is already available, I think a couple of the things that I just noted, right, is that on the ICE website itself, and I don't know that this is like the best way to compile this information, but through years of advocacy with the agency and the past administrations, ICE does put information obtained from FOIA requests on their website. So they have like a FOIA reading room that you can access on the ICE website itself. I frankly have not been on there in a little while, so I can't comment on whether it's actually accessible or what kind of order it's in, but those documents are available, and there is some kind of chart at least where they keep track of all the various FOIA requests that are pending or that they have responded to. And then the other two spots is, so AIC and other partners host a website called Hold CBP Accountable. And that's a really great website with links to litigation and FOIA documents. And then the other two organizations, Detention Watch Network and the National Immigrant Justice Center, have really great links and information as well to FOIA requests and litigation that they've done, and then documents that they've received subsequent to that litigation or to those requests. In particular around inspections and audits and contracts between ICE and local governments or private prison companies.
And I'm going to do one more thing before camera goes, is that on the making things publicly available, I mean, there is a burden on the government to do that under the FOIA statute. And I think this is an area that needs to be explored further. And I think that we've all been very focused on our particular issues we want to find out information about. But I think to take a step back and think about what should already be available, not just because we've requested it from ICE or they've already produced it to someone and then we ask them to show us what they've already produced to someone. I mean, it's this whole sort of nonsensical process where there actually is a burden on the government to place documents on their website in many cases without having them to be even requested through the FOIA process. So.
Yeah, no, one thing that I wanted to add, a couple of things. So basically from a research standpoint, I want to emphasize how chaotic the FOIA productions usually are. So once you get them, it's not that you just post it on the website. I want to emphasize what Emily said. There is a lot of work that needs to happen in terms of reviewing materials, curating whatever makes sense. There are tons and tons of sheets of paper that don't have any relevant information or any information that you can even understand what it means, because there are codes, there are huge redactions, and so it's really hard to make sense of the information you get sometimes. And the other thing that the government in general, at least in our experience, has been very reluctant in terms of sharing code books or what are the definitions of the terms they use to classify the information or to, label information that they have. The other thing is that what we learned, Emily and I are trying to figure out how we can be more systematic about our FOIA work, because the reality is that with limited resources, you are only going after like the most pressing issue of the time, and you don't really have the capacity to be tracking data on some particular areas on a regular basis more systematically, and being able to identify trends and to have like longer term monitoring capacity. So I really think that that's a gap that we are trying to see how we can fill. And of course, we're not going to cover everything that is immigration enforcement related or immigration related, but how we can identify some opportunities where we can really be more systematic about keeping pressure on the government, so we can not only obtain the information, but also curate it, review it, and make it accessible in a way that people can really use. And then the third thing I wanted to say is that what we learned is that even if we spend all these resources in terms of developing a platform to like share this information, to organize it and all that, there is, and we assume that there is a need for this information, but you really need to educate and attract users to these resources. And so that cannot be underestimated. And I think that that's where a collaboration with you guys could be extremely beneficial, because once we obtain this information, or if we have this wealth of information, how do we ensure that this gets to the hands of people who can really do something with it? And I think that, I don't know, publicizing it or having links to this repository, or finding ways in which libraries can guide people and inform people of the existence of this information would be extremely helpful.
So
Great.
there's a question about how often we use documents or data that other organizations have had to FOIA, or do we do it ourselves? I think it's a combination. I mean, I know that we've done collaborative FOIA requests with organizations before. I've done them on our own. I think, to Emily's point, there has been, and thanks to Emily and others at AIC for thinking through how we can better coordinate and collaborate on FOIA requests and information that we're thinking about obtaining through FOIA and have obtained through FOIA. There is greater sort of thinking around this question, but yeah.
Yeah, and I think that we are, I mean, I certainly am, and I've noticed that others are, through this FOIA listserv we've created and in other spaces, making certain that we really aren't we're not duplicating each other's work, because a lot of us are concerned about a lot of the same issues, and there may be, I mean, I feel like it comes up more frequently in terms of, is someone going to challenge this particular problem, this unlawful action by the government in a suit that really brings like legal claims, there's been a constitutional violation or some other, statutory violation? Or is it going to be a challenge, or are we going to FOIA that? And if we're going to FOIA it, are we, do we need to speak to the people who are litigating that issue? And so, for example, the ACLU is litigating, challenging the family separation practices. And so we have a FOIA pending, and those things are not in conflict, but I think it just sort of goes to the idea of we need to make sure that all the information that we're gathering in different places, we're all using for the similar purpose to, move things forward, to create better policies and to challenge.
Thank you for sharing that link to the Open the Government. I have not seen that before, so I will definitely take a look.
Yeah, I think it's a great wiki. I've looked at it.
Jesse, did you want to ask your question over the mic?
Yeah, and I wanted to, the presentation has been really terrific. Thank you so much for this. And yeah, I'm really curious more, about these collaborative FOIA efforts in terms of kind of documenting what's been successful and, what challenges groups have run into. And just wanted to, share this. So, Open the Government released this a couple of weeks ago. It's a kind of running resource with success stories of how groups have worked together, worked with other organizations that litigate, worked with journalists, technologists, worked with groups doing FOIA work at the state level, which is another kind of area to get access to information. And so the idea of this is to invite groups to add to it and add their success stories and, kind of feed this discussion on what works and then how to use the information for advocacy campaigns. So everything in this presentation has been really kind of terrific for that. And I'm also, curious about the FOIA working group and how that has been successful in bringing folks together. I'd be interested in learning more about that and, how to bring kind of FOIA experts together with experts on immigration rights issues and how to pull that all together. And then the one other piece was just thinking about the FOIA reading rooms, and if other groups have seen instances where documents have been removed or taken down. We've documented a couple cases, or just seen a few instances where there's FOIA, the ICE FOIA reading room has been taken down, and when it went back online, there were some noticeable documents that were taken away related to secure communities, which was a kind of huge red flag. Like, why did they take those documents away. So I'm wondering if other groups have noticed that.
We've definitely noticed it. Yeah, I don't know. We've definitely noticed it. I don't know, we haven't done, we at the ACLU haven't really done like a formal sort of tracking of what's been up and what's come down. And we've been keeping an eye on it. And certainly at the beginning of the administration, we kind of did sort of backups to all the documents that were available on the ICE website. But yeah.
This is, I think, sometimes I think we have to take advantage of being in Washington, D.C. a little bit more, and I'm guilty of not doing that as much as I probably should, but I really do think that we probably need to sit down, if possible, and have conversations with some of these privacy offices and figure out, ask, very straightforward questions about why this sort of thing happens and what is, what are the best processes, what are best practices for submitting FOIA requests. And I think having some basic conversations about how their FOIA officers work, how these offices function would be really helpful. And so I'm hoping through this working group that we can do some of that. But Jesse, this is Emily. Feel free to reach out to me. You'll see my email address on our website, and Rachel can give you my contact information. I'd be happy to have an offline conversation. I'm talking to tons of people about just collaborating in every way possible. And we're trying to track all these different efforts that are popping up everywhere, inside and outside of the immigration space.
Yeah,
Terrific, thank you.
I know you guys probably want to wrap it up, but I just have two items I want to say. One is that, a lot of attention has been paid to the environmental information that's been taken down or potentially jeopardized by the new administration, not so new administration. And less attention has been paid to the kind of the way that immigration related information hasn't ever been made available, like contrary to what actually should be constitutionally or legally done. And so I think it might be, I would love to hear and maybe later talk to you guys about amplifying that a little bit more, that it's not just environmental data that's endangered, it's like actually information we're entitled to about what's happening in immigration detention centers that hasn't ever been made available to us. And then I just also wanted to ask for if we could get a little bit of a update on what's going on with that, the thing you were talking about, Victoria, that happened in August. What's the status of that records destruction request that ICE had made to NARA?
Sorry, I meant to give an update and then I just kept talking. So it's still pending. I mean, as far as we know in the conversations with NARA is that they were going back. I mean, they were really, I think it's okay to share that they were overwhelmed with the response from the public opposing the record schedule. And they were in conversation with ICE about how to revise their proposal, and then they were going to reissue it, and that has not happened yet. In that process, NARA also affirmed that they were going to be sort of posting more information to their website and reaching out to organizations, civil society organizations, to inform them of when this was coming again. So we're still waiting to see if ICE reissues their records retention schedule, and then of course following and monitoring and making sure that folks in the public know what's going on.
Great. Any final comments or words anyone wants to say?
Just thank you.
Yeah, thanks on our end
I
for
think,
pulling us into this conversation. It's been really interesting to connect on these issues.
Yeah, and looking forward to like sort of reconnecting and having conversations about moving this work forward with you all.
Yeah, I know that our group is definitely interested in continuing this conversation, and we're really grateful that you guys made the time to share some of your work experience and knowledge with us. It's such important work you do, where we really want to continue to work alongside of you.
Great.
Thank
Thanks,
you so
Rachel,
much.
and everyone else.
Thank you.
All right, great. Thanks,
Bye.
everyone.
Bye-bye.